Here, we are going to make an embroidery patch. For this part, we have provided the dimensions according to the design. Just cut it out directly. No additional stitching is needed. I have two sizes connected together here. Just add their lengths together. The widths are the same, because this side needs ironing. This way I can finish ironing it all at once. There's no need to iron it in two parts. You can combine the two sizes. You can also do them individually. It depends on your personal preference. Here, we need to fold the fabric in half and iron it first. The side facing up now is the front. The side folded inside is the back. Next, we will use this middle fold as a guide. Align the top fabric and iron it once more. Align the bottom fabric and iron it as well. After it has been ironed, because this bag of mine consists of two lengths clamped together. So I cut it in half from the center. After cutting, this individual length is the length specified in our drawing. Then we continue to fold it this way. After folding, we fold it towards the length side. Find its center point. You can mark it yourself. We need to be at the red line. It's the position we just marked. Draw a short line there. It looks like this after drawing here. I suggest staying close to the crease end. Leave a little on the edge. Don't draw it out completely, because if it's completely drawn out, the position of the finished sharp corner will reveal the limit. So this position can be left a bit empty. Next, we open the bag. Open it like this at the top. Close both sides. Align it with the front like this. A small triangle will appear. Tidy it up a bit. Try to line both sides. After tidying it up, let's also tidy up the bottom a bit. Once aligned, we start removing the lines from the tail end. The other bag is also made using this method. This is what it looks like after both bags are completed. Then we set this part aside for later use. Next, we'll work on the collar part. The two pieces of fabric are facing each other. The top layer is made of twill fabric. The bottom layer uses thin, high-count cotton. At the beginning and end of the collar, extend outwards by a distance of 5 millimeters. Let's start removing the seam again. The positions of these two arcs in the middle are not unstitched. When sewing the collar, we can set the stitch distance a little smaller. It's easier to adjust the arc. After it's done, we cut it away. Leave a 5 millimeter seam allowance where there is no side seam. This position of the side arc, I directly cut it here with lace trimming scissors. I don't have lace scissors. Sisters just make some cuts themselves. Then turn both collars to the front. Organize and iron a bit. The two pressed collars are set aside for now. Now let's create the pockets. For this pocket, we need to mark it on the front piece first. Mark the location of this pocket. One method is to cut out this position directly, then trace along the inner position. I'm using a different method here. Use a needle to make 2 holes at the edge, then create 2 holes in it. Then we use a simple design. Align the positions of the 2 holes at the edge. Just draw the shape. Another front piece can also be made using this method. Additionally, let's take another look. On this drawing, this part consists of a straight line and 2 triangles. We draw this line on the fabric. Then we still need a strip of fabric. This is what I have already cut. It's just a piece of fabric folded in half. Then take the pattern for the strip of fabric. Align it along the folded edge. After drawing the line along the edge, leave 5 millimeters for seam allowance, and then you can cut it off. Because the pocket section is indeed a bit small and quite complicated. So I switched to a larger piece of fabric. Let me demonstrate for you. Otherwise, it's hard to see the process clearly with small fabric. This method is the same as the one mentioned earlier. It's just that we've switched to a larger piece of fabric. Here, we also need to prepare 2 pieces of fabric for the pockets. When we draw the pockets, we flip them over from left to right, because we are currently working on the pocket of the left front piece. So this one on the left is the main fabric, the one on the right is the lining fabric. Then when we work on the right front piece shortly, the fabric shape on the right is made from the outer fabric. Then the fabric shape on the left is made from the lining. Here, we first put the lining underneath the front, this straight seam line on the pocket fabric. It should align with the line drawn on the front. Align with the straight line on the far left. When flipping to the front, make sure to check again whether they are aligned. Once the alignment is confirmed, I am holding it down with my hand here. You feel uneasy? If you're worried it might shift position, you can use a bamboo pin to secure it. Then we will align this line on the right. Align it with the line above the edge. The top and bottom corners should be aligned. Begin stitching from the top point, sew down to the bottom point. Be sure to start from the point, then finish at the point. Don't sew too much. After sewing, check if the seams are in the correct position. Then turn it to the reverse side. We will trim this excess part here. It can be trimmed off. Leave about a 3 millimeter seam allowance on the edge. Then we return to the front side. Take the other pocket fabric, align it with this line on the left. The points at the top and bottom should also be aligned. Then sew it together. Here, we also sew from point to point. Do not go beyond. Both sides have been sewn up. We need to cut along this center line. If it's a smaller fabric, this area might be obstructed. We can just pull this apart on both sides. Once you cut to the triangle, you can't proceed further. Follow the line and move to the side. Here we need to cut to the root of the thread. The root of the thread refers to the last stitch. You can see there's a white thread here. The position of the needle hole for this thread is at the root of the thread. We cut to this position, but we cannot cut the thread. If this area is not cut properly, we will flip it over later. There will be wrinkles here, uneven. But cutting too much is definitely not allowed, so everyone here should manage it on their own. The other 3 positions follow the same cutting method. Once it's cut well, we will start from this opening. Turn the pocket fabric and the bag's edge inside. After it's turned inside, its front appears like this. Then we will lift the front piece. Insert the triangle into its position, along the edge of this triangle. Mark a line measurement to secure it. Take note of this piece of pocket fabric. Make sure not to sew it in. The pocket fabric. At this moment, I am turning it to the other side. We will only sew the triangle to the edge of the pocket. I'm concerned that everyone here might not understand. I will mark this sewing spot with a red line. Before we start sewing this time, first, use your hand to hold down the position of the triangle. Then check if the corners on the front are smooth. Start sewing the red line only after confirming it is even. After sewing, it looks like this on the front side. Then we will use the same method. Secure the triangle on the other end as well. After securing both sides, it looks like this on the front side. Then we start marking the visible line from this position. Measure along the edge like this until you reach this position. The visible line looks just like this. Then we turn back to the reverse side. Here we need to align and sew the 2 pieces of pocket fabric together. When sewing, be careful not to stitch into the fabric of the front piece. You can shift them a little to the side, especially at the start and the finish. It's easy to accidentally stitch into the front piece's fabric. These 2 spots, we can sew a little outside the seam line. That's perfectly fine too. As long as we sew these 2 pieces together, it's good. Once we finish sewing this pocket section, it's done. Then we use the same method to create another pocket. The colored pieces on the left look like this pocket. This pocket fabric is placed underneath like this. It's the same as earlier over there. Then we sew this like this. Sewing at this position is along this edge. Then the sewing at this position on this side is along this edge. And the remaining methods are the same as before. It's just that the placement is a bit different. The bottom looks like this. Next, let's handle the lower part of the coat's fabric. There are 3 marking points at the top here. We fold it along the middle position of this marking point. Then from the position of this marking point on the side, we draw a short line from it. After sewing it well, we open this position like this. Then we press down the position of the middle marking point, concerning the position of the style at the bottom. Next, we'll shift the style position a couple of millimeters to the right. Draw a line to fix it temporarily. Once drawn, it looks like this. Make sure not to draw on the style line, since this is merely a temporary fixing line. If you mark on the style line, just a moment if we're going to connect the upper part later. When turned to the front, it will show the route. After drawing here, turning to the front looks like this. Next, let's work on the 2 front pieces of the outer fabric. The method for the front and back pieces is the same. It's just that the distance between these 3 marked points will be slightly closer. Here, everyone can just repeat the previous steps. After finishing all the front and back pieces, this is how it looks on the front. Next, let's work on the lower half of the lining's front and back pieces. In fact, the method for the lining is the same as that for the outer fabric. However, there is one slight difference. That is, our previous steps were done on the reverse side of the fabric. But now, the steps need to be done on the front side of the fabric. So we need to mark this point on the front side of the fabric. After marking the points, we will repeat the previous steps. Just remember that we need to do it on the front side of the fabric. Similarly, we fold based on this central marking point. What we are folding in now is the back side of the lining fabric. Facing up is the front side of the lining fabric. Here, I will compare the finished lining with the back piece of the outer fabric. This is the front side of the fabric, and this is the back side. They are both in opposite positions, because they are only opposite. Let's wait until we finish the product. This position will be aligned only then. So everyone must pay attention to this issue to avoid mistakes. Next, we will stitch the upper and lower parts of the lining together. Here, we first stitch the back piece of the lining with the right sides together. Align the front and back pieces to sew this edge. Just sew it directly along the seam. Once sewn, it looks like this on the front. Then we will remove the basting stitch on top to make it smoother. Here, when we remove the basting stitches, the bottom style is oriented towards the neckline. After measuring, it looks like this. Then we continue to join the front piece of the lining. It is also facing the right sides together. Sew at the position of this top line. Then turn it to the right side. Remove the basting stitches. After joining both the front and back pieces. Now we place them right sides together, the location of the pointed seam. Then we separate the edges of the pointed seam position to both sides. Start attaching the sleeves. Make some marks on the sleeves, because it has a front and a back. The marked back position connects to the back piece. The marked front position connects to the front piece. This also requires attention. Don't get it wrong. When sewing, we align the front pieces. Then proceed along this curve. Adjust the upper and lower arcs as you pull back. When you reach the pointed seam position, check if the bottom design is separating to the sides. Use the same method to apply to the sleeve on the other side. When unfolded, this is how it looks after finishing both sleeves. Next, we repeat the previous steps. Handle the lining piece in the same manner. This is the assembled outer fabric. Now, let's secure the sleeve badge section first. First, fold the bottom edge of the sleeve. Find its center point and make a mark. To make it easier for everyone to understand, I will also draw its design line on the front. That is the design line on the back. Then we take this design line as a reference. Measure 1 centimeter upwards. I will also draw a line here Then we align the sleeve insignia. Note that our sleeve insignia should be placed on the side close to the front piece. The same goes for the other sleeve that we will do shortly. The badge is placed near the front panel at this position. This position between the triangles aligns with the center. The excess part on the left side can be trimmed off. We can first sew a few stitches to secure it, then we can trim. Regarding these few stitches, we also sew this style slightly off to the side, because this is a temporary fix. After sewing, it looks like this. Let's take a look at the front and back. The two sides of the patch are temporarily fixed using the same method. This is how it looks. Make sure not to misplace this position. Then, let's take a look at the comparison. It's the opening position of the front panel. The two sides are layered together. Let's check if this part rises. If both sides are aligned, we can move on to the next step. If one side is longer than the other, that means there is an error during sewing. You must make timely adjustments. Next, we need to address the opening position of the front piece. I have also marked the style line on the front side at the bottom. Then we take out 2 button strips and place them opposite to these 2 positions on the front. Align the style line along the edge. The same applies to the other side. After folding, flip this position to the front. Remove the visible marking line. At this point, our style is directed to the left. The bright line is folded like this. Then we also flip the other side to the front. Take away the bright line. The style at the bottom here is directed to the left. After both sides' bright lines have been removed, let's apply the collar. I also marked the style line on this collar. Everyone can also use the collar's design. Align with the collar's edge. Draw this style line. This is for our collar. It can be handled more neatly. Next, we need to find the center point of the back collar. We align the positions of these 2 peaks, folded in half. Find and mark this point. Then the back of our collar aligns with this point. The front should align with the position next to the button. And of course, the arcs in between are not identical. Everyone should still follow the curvature. It means that the starting and ending points are roughly similar. Now we will begin measuring the seam. The collar aligns with the position next to the buttonhole. When we measure the seam here, we can measure about 1 or 2 millimeters to the right of the style line, because this is fixed for the collar. After measuring, let's take a look. Here I have actually surpassed the center point at the back. It's approximately 1 millimeter away. Here we need to have some overlap. It's when we place the second collar on. If there is no overlap at all, then the collar we make in the end. There will be a small gap in this area. Just a 1 or 2 millimeter overlap is sufficient. Then align the collar. Continue measuring the seam a bit inward along the style line. After the collar is measured, we take out the collar fabric and place it facing the front of the outer fabric. There is an additional button position under this side of the outer fabric. We need to sew this edge of the collar fabric to the edge of the button position. Sew them together. The opening on the other side is the same. After measuring both sides, when we open it, it looks like this. The button strip connects at both ends. This position connects the outer fabric and the front opening of the collar fabric. The other side is the same. To make it flatter, we will also remove the visible thread from this side of the collar fabric. At this time, the direction at the bottom is leaning to the left. We also need to remove the visible thread from the other side. After we have removed the visible thread from both sides, we will turn the fabric back to the reverse side, so that the collar fabric and the front side are facing each other. Here we need to pay attention. Both side edges have button positions. This button position is half on the collar fabric and half on the front side. So when we are facing each other, we need to place it on the collar fabric and the upper part. This design matches. After matching, we start sewing along the collar's edge. During sewing, because we previously sewed the collar with a stitch guide. At that time, this stitch guide, I withdrew the stitches about 1 millimeter to the right of the style line. So now, when I sew, I can sew directly along this style line. When we are almost finished sewing, next, I'll discuss the front piece of this group. There is a section for stitching here. Let's take a moment to notice this. We will first use this fabric to shape the lining. The lining will be made from this fabric. After completing the painting, we will cut this open. Then, we will paint the 2 pieces of fabric separately. Each will incorporate their own style. Here, we will first prepare a border for the group project. We will cut the border to the dimensions specified in the drawing. There's no need to add extra strokes. Fold the edge and iron it gently first. Then we draw the design line. The upper part measures 5 millimeters. The remaining part below is the edge we will draw. Here we are 2 millimeters to the left of this design line, and we draw a folding line 2 millimeters to the right. When drawing the folding line, the line spacing can be slightly increased. What I am using here is number 4. Do not backstitch. Simultaneously, bring the 2 bottom lines closer together. Pull this piece of paper out. One side feels like it's getting difficult to pull. Then switch to the other side. After pulling out this document, it needs to be organized. We will stitch it to this position on the curve. Note that this is the front side of the fabric. I just traced the position of this curve again on the front side. This makes it easier for us to stitch the edges. Let's first adjust the length of the edge. The adjusted size aligns with this arc. Then we will align the edge with the front piece. Sew along the upper and lower design lines. Once sewn, we will flip it to the front to check. If everything looks good, we can remove the outer drawstring. Then we take out this pieced part of our skirt. Align the front sides of these 2 curves. Sew while following the curves up and down. After pulling, turn it to the front. We will create a clear line at this position. This will make the edge of the drawing smoother. After pulling the clear line, we will trim the edges of the drawing at both ends. Then take out the two back pieces and place them facing the front piece. Sew at the pointed seam. Set aside the front and back pieces after they are prepared. Let's start with the sleeve section. There are two lines on the sleeve. We need to sew the elastic band onto these two lines. Before sewing the elastic band, let's first take care of the bottom edge. Fold the edge along the style line inward. Sew along the edge. First, sew a line to secure it. Then we'll attach this elastic band. The elastic band is on the reverse side of the sleeve. Here, I'm starting with the one that's closer to the bottom edge. This is where we actually sew the elastic band. It's from this point to that point. All of this adheres to the style. Because if we take this elastic band, the car is positioned outside the design. Then when we perform the final stitching, this design will be a bit thicker, so it's best to keep the car within the design. But when we initially loosen the straps, you can start by placing some outward. It's just that our stitching point is within the design. At the start, let's make a few back stitches to secure it. Then pull the elastic band as tight as it can go. This means it's pulled to the point where it can't be stretched any further. Sew along the position of the underline. Sew to the point where you need to stop. It should also be within this design line. Trim off the excess parts. You can take a look at this. They are all not sewn beyond the seam line. Then we will use the same method. We will also add elasticity to the top one. This way, one sleeve's elasticity is complete. Now let's work on the other sleeve. Also, use the same method to add some elasticity. Next, let's look at the upper part of the sleeve. This position has two marked points. We need to gather the fabric in the area between these 2 points. Here I only stitched one line while gathering. It should also be set to a stitch distance of 4. Then, we should not backstitch at the front and back. I stitched this folding line outside of the guideline. Pull the bottom line tight to extract this fold. After extracting the fold, let's compare it with the sleeve cap. Let's compare it like this. Check if the size fits. If it fits, we can put on the sleeves. If it doesn't fit, we'll make adjustments. For the sleeve, we align it with the front, then sew while following the curve. During the sewing process, if you feel the folds are uneven, you can make adjustments again. When facing peak positions, remember that this style should be separated to both sides. The sleeves on both sides should look like this. Next, let's handle the lining. The lining does not need to be joined, so we can just cut it out as a whole piece. There's no need to cut off the curved part. The position where the peaks are sewn together with the front sides facing each other. Then we will unfold the lining and the outer fabric. This is also where the neckline is sewn together with the front sides facing each other. After measuring the collar, we'll make some notches on it. I will directly use the pinking shears here. If there are no friends with pinking shears, just use regular scissors to make the notches. Then we directly sew the two sides of the collar. The position of the opening at the back, then sew the side seam of the neckline. Both side seams need to be sewn. It's the side seam that goes down to the armpit. Note that the front sides are aligned here as well. Next, sew the side seam of the sleeve of the outer fabric, and sew the entire side seam of the doctor's pattern. Also, sew them together with the right sides facing each other. Then sew the side seam of the other sleeve, and the side seam of the doctor's pattern. After sewing is complete, remember to attach a button at the underarm position. Buttons are needed at both underarm positions. After sewing the buttons, let's sew the bottom edge. Just sew along the seam line. When you reach the style position in the middle, we need to separate this style towards both sides. Next, we make a diagonal cut at the right angle of the side seam. Be careful not to cut the thread. Also, don't forget to cut the right angle at both ends of the collar. Then we can start from the embroidered dragon position at the bottom. Flip the fabric to the front side. After flipping, iron it first. After ironing it flat, if the stitching is acceptable, let's measure the bright line again. Just measure a bright line all around the edge. Here we need to prepare 2 threads for making this collar. This is just regular sewing thread. Just cut off 2 small pieces. This will help us turn this pointed corner later. Make sure to prepare it in advance. We stack 2 pieces of fabric together for the collar. The front sides should be facing each other. I am using lightweight twill fabric for the top layer, and for the bottom layer, I am using thin cotton fabric. When sewing, you need to leave an opening. I think I'll stay in this position. Then I'll start stitching from this point on the right. Follow the stitching line. We'll first stitch to this position near the pointed corner. Here, I stop at the frame just before reaching the pointed corner. It must be the location of the previous frame. In other words, if we measure one more frame, this frame perfectly reaches the corner position. We stop 1 frame ahead. Then we use the sewing thread we prepared earlier. Insert it like this from the middle. This thread is just caught by the needle. Then we will measure 1 more frame ahead. Just 1 frame is sufficient. After completing the measurement of this frame, the sewing thread is stuck behind the needle. Then we hold both ends of the thread with our hands and pull it forward together. At this point, the thread cannot be pulled out. If at this moment your thread comes out directly, it means that the needle is not properly positioned. If it's stuck in position, this thread can't be pulled out. Then we wrap this thread around from the left to the back. Hide the sewing thread at the very edge. When we want to continue sewing further, the sewing machine cannot reach this thread, so it must be tucked away deep inside. Next, continue sewing downward. Sew along the line until you reach the frame just before the next corner. Use the same method to tuck in the thread. Then hide the thread in the same place. After securing it, continue sewing forward. Sew continuously until you reach the other point of the return. We now need to cut the collar off. Leave a standard 5 millimeters at the return point. I use decorative scissors for the remaining areas. Please note that if you don't have decorative scissors, the areas with larger curves, you'll also need to make some cuts with regular scissors. It looks like this after cutting. Then we pull it from the inside edge. Flip the collar to the front. We also use hemostatic clamps. Pull the fabric out. After the fabric is pulled out, let's organize it. Over here at the sharp angle, there's the wire we just inserted. Be sure to hold both ends of this wire at the same time. Then pull it out. It will pull out this pointed corner. You shouldn't only pull one end. If you pull one end, you'll pull out the entire line. Both sides are identical. Then we tidy up this collar, press it well. After pressing it well, it looks like this. Set the collar aside for now. Let's continue with this. The bow decoration on top. This shape in the video, there are two of them. One is a bit longer, one is a bit shorter. Because their production methods are the same, I will only demonstrate one of them. We are positioned in a straight line. Leave a notch of about 1 centimeter. Then from this point below the notch, start sewing a circle to another point. After measuring, let's trim a little. The method of tying a bow, it's the same as how we cut the collar earlier. Then similarly, use clamps to flip it over. Arrange it after flipping it over. Press it lightly. The reverse edge can be sewn together using a long stitch technique. This is the shorter section of the bow. The other part is longer. We will do it using the same approach. Here's what I have finished, the two components of this bow. First, handle this shorter one on top. Fold it in half towards the front. After folding the top part in half, fold it back. The bottom part should also be folded back the same way. Then I'm using QQ line here. I tied this position in the middle together. If there's no QQ line available, you can simply tie a knot with regular string. Next, we will deal with another part, the method for the other part. This is the same as that. We can just repeat the previous steps. Take the two finished parts of the bow, stack them like this. Then in the middle, we'll tie it up using QQ wire. Next, we'll create the fabric for this little vest's lining and outer layer is the same. The method of making it is also the same, because my outer layer is black checkered. The stitching on it is not very noticeable, so I will demonstrate it here using the lining fabric. There are 2 provincial roads ahead. Then there is 1 provincial road on each of the other 2 sections. We need to manage this provincial road here first. Simply fold this little hillside in half like this. Now the side facing up is the bottom side. We sew on the reverse side of the fabric. After sewing, trim the seat seam a little like this. Then spread the remaining seat seam to both sides. Be careful not to cut the stitches. The other provincial roads are also done using this method. All 4 provincial roads have been measured. We are now placing the fabric fronts together. The locations of the seams and pointed seams. Everyone can work on the fabric themselves. Similarly, we will first sew the seams, then sew the pointed seams together. After the sewing is complete, we align the pointed seams of the outer fabric and the lining fabric. Spread them all out to the sides. Then stack them together with the front sides facing each other. First, let's sew this area of the collar. After measuring, we need to make cuts at the 4 right angle positions. Be careful not to cut through the stitches, but we also can't make the cuts too shallow. If it's too shallow, it might turn out uneven when flipped over. Next, sew at the rust cage positions on both sides. There might be a slight problem with the phone over here, so the video at the sewing and rust cage position was not recorded. It's just these 2 lines on both sides of the rust spot. Here, everyone just needs to align and sew it themselves. Sewing and finishing also requires making cut buttons with a particular style. I have completed the cut button on the right side. Now let's make the cut button on the left side. Here, I use a fabric cutting scissors to make the cut button. If there are friends who do not have fabric cutting scissors, just use regular scissors to make the button. After making the button, we use these straight clamps. Insert it from the pointed seam at the front. Clamp a piece of the lining fabric, then pull it back. After the fabric is pulled over, we shouldn't continue using the straight clamp. Just use your hands to slowly pull it over. The process shouldn't be too harsh. Be careful not to damage the fabric. The front piece on the other side is also like this. Pull it over and turn it over. Once both sides have been flipped. Now, let's steam the edges and corners. Make it a little more even. This is how it looks after I have transported it successfully. Now we will join the front piece and the back piece together at the surface. We need to sew this line. Sew from the surface to the inside like this. The other side also needs to sew at this location. When sewing, the center style position should be aligned. You can secure it stitch by stitch on your own. Then you can simply sew along the style line. Once the sewing is finished, we will spread the style area apart to both sides. Then combine the inner and outer parts together. Next, take out this bottom strip. Here we can first fold it and iron it slightly. The folded part is the reverse side. Once it's finished, it looks like this. Then we first open the fabric and align the front side of the bottom edge with the surface. Sew along the style line. Be careful not to sew into the lining. First, set the lining aside. Only sew this top layer. During the sewing process, there are areas with structures underneath. This structure should separate to both sides. Continuously sewing will create an extra segment at the end. This is the reserved part. Just trim along the edge. Just trim it off. After sewing, it looks like this on the front. Check to confirm there are no issues. We turn the lining inside out from the top down and alongside the other side of the bottom edge, matching the front along the seam line. Pay attention while sewing. Tuck some of the middle fabric inside. Don't measure the fabric in the middle, just like we sewed the front part earlier. Just sew along the seam line completely. The fabric looks like this now. It forms a complete circle. Now we need to sew it together. The two side edges, which are the openings in the back. Here, we start from the neckline and move down. Neatly arrange the fabric. Make sure to pay attention. Our bottom edge, half of it is on the inside, half of it is on the surface. Don't get it wrong. After organizing it, just sew down along the edge's seam line. You only need to leave the flap on one side. It's roughly in this position. There's about a 1.5 centimeter space. Organize everything and start.
Next, we will make socks. The reason I didn't mention from the beginning where to start sewing is, it's because if the sewing position is on knit fabric, you fold it down like this. When it's very short here, it's difficult to sew with a home machine. Let's leave a little more for it first. After the car is done, we'll go pick it up. To make the stitching on our socks more secure, let's fold it down first. You can take a look, mark these points. It's this point. On the other side, this side is the front. Mark the points on the edge of the sock. Take a look, this is the front. Then we draw the line on the reverse side. After marking, fold it along this line. The place where we put the needle is at the point we marked. First, we backstitch 1 or 2 stitches to secure it. Then continue sewing forward. When the car reaches this point, then move the car forward by 1 or 2 notches and also reverse 1 notch. All right, we have now reached the new point. Then backtrack 2 notches, stop. Continue walking forward. Walk to this point. Then stop again. Stop, stop. Keep walking forward. Keep walking forward. Walk to this point. Then stop again. Also go back 1 or 2 steps. Continue walking forward. Continue walking forward. Walk to this point, then continue the previous operation to rewind the needle. Then continue the previous operation to rewind the needle. Let's take a look now. Why do I need to rewind the needle at this point? When we cut later, we will cut along this edge like this to create a little seam for cutting. There are times when we have to reinsert the needle. We often wear and remove it like this. It will be more secure. This thread won't come loose. Now that the thread has been pulled, let's cut a little, just like this, flat. Cut off the excess seams. Don't cut this line. 3 to 4 millimeters outside this line is fine. If you cut it this short from the beginning, then when you go to cut it again, the edges won't be as easy to cut. Okay, now it's after we finished cutting, fold it like this. These are all the wrong sides. The marked areas are all the wrong sides. Besides the right side, we made a few marks. The socks are folded in half. This line runs along the edge. Unpick the seam. After sewing, move outward along the edge, about 3 or 4 millimeters. Cut off the sock, the area with a larger curvature. You need to cut an additional opening. Be careful not to cut into the seams. Also, don't cut too deep. After you finish cutting, flip the entire sock inside out. The socks are ready. Let's take a look now. This is the sock that has been heat pressed with designs. I applied the heat transfer on this side. The side is this way. Iron it directly here. Then this is ironed on the front side. Just do it like this. The side seam is at the back, and then it's ironed flat like this. Then regarding my socks, it is the ankle area. It is naturally narrower. If you like it a bit wider, you can refer to the one from 2 episodes ago, that Christmas drawings design. Now we will demonstrate the long stitch method. First, the end of the thread is hidden inside the fabric. we need to pull the needle out from inside the fabric. Aligning with this needle exit point, we insert the needle into another piece of fabric above. Can we see it clearly from this point? This point is the same as that point. Then we enter from this side and come out from this place. The distance between the needle entry and exit here is about 3 millimeters. You can make it a bit denser when you do it, and that's fine. Next, we also enter the needle at the same spot on the cloth below. The needle should be positioned about 3 millimeters away. This next step is also a repetition. It's simply a matter of doing it up and down repeatedly. After completing the reverse stitch, you can tighten the thread. Simply pull the needle through and tie a knot. Then insert the needle into the fabric. Just pull. Here, we're going to create a sewing box for cage repair. First, we'll cut a few notches on this edge. This is on the lining material. Make sure not to cut too deep with the notches. Fold it inward. Inner fold. Scrape one side of the fold with your nail to shape it a bit. After completing the inner fold, we take the inner part, which is our cuff. The seam of the cuff, pull it out slightly. Align it with the inner part. You can secure it with your hands. There is a pointed seam on the top, then align it with the pointed seam of the outer part. There is a side seam here. The lower side seam also aligns with the inner side seam. Be careful not to stab your hand. Now let's stitch it together. When we stitch to the outer part, it must be on this seam. You really shouldn't sew into the outer fabric. Otherwise, you will see it from the front. I am currently on this seam. It means a stitch has gone into the surface seam. Then we bring the needle over to it, directly fold the inner part that we've already prepared. Sew a stitch at the edge. If the sisters are skilled with the long needle method, they can use it. It will look more aesthetically pleasing. If this method isn't used well, it's still okay. Just a single stitch through. The top is the inner part, then the bottom is the seam of the outer layer. Just keep repeating this way. Okay? After finishing a round of stitching, you can just tie a knot here. If we stitch to the outer layer, you will see the thread at this edge. So we can't sew to the outer section. We can only sew to the stitching, and that's how it's completed.